Tonight, we are going to Rome. Not the Rome of travel photography. Not the Rome you see on someone else's Instagram, all golden light and gelato, and the Colosseum framed at magic hour. Not the Rome that every European film of the 1960s seemed to suggest was simply waiting for you to arrive and fall in love with it. We are going to the real Rome, the one that coexisted with all of that beauty and glamour and managed for a remarkably long time to stay hidden beneath it. The Rome that the postcard never showed you. The Rome that the people on Via Veneto had a very strong interest in keeping invisible. And this story, like Rome itself, will not go where you expect. There is a famous photograph taken on Via Veneto sometime around 1960. A woman in a fur stole sits at an outdoor cafe table, a pale drink in a glass before her on the white cloth. Behind her, slightly out of focus at the edge of the frame, two men with cameras are watching. She is looking away from them, chin raised, carrying the whole scene with the practiced ease of someone who has long understood that being observed is simply part of the arrangement. The photograph is beautiful. It is also, if you look at it long enough, slightly sinister. The way so many beautiful things in that city, in that era, could be if you let yourself actually look. Rome in the early 1960s was doing something that no other city on earth was quite managing with the same confidence. It was persuading the entire world that it had transcended ordinary life. That here, in the warm light and the ruins and the piazzas and the particular quality of an Italian evening, something had been found that was simply better than anywhere else. That human beings, given the right circumstances, the right light, the right food, the right attitude toward pleasure and time, could arrive at a way of living that deserved to be called the sweet life. La Dolce Vita. And Italy, in those years, had genuine and extraordinary reasons to feel this way. The country had emerged from the Second World War in ruins. Physical, moral, political. The bombs, the occupation, the decades of fascism, the shame and division of having supported a regime that ended in catastrophe. That wound was real, and it was deep. And yet, somehow, Italy had done what seemed impossible. It had rebuilt. Economists still discuss it as the miracolo economico, the economic miracle, a period of growth through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s that matched the post-war recoveries of West Germany and Japan, the two other nations the world had assumed would need the longest to recover. Italy's gross domestic product expanded at rates that stunned observers. By 1960, the country had clawed its way to becoming the seventh largest economy in the world. And for a nation where, at the start of that same decade, just 7% of households had the combination of electricity, running water, and an indoor toilet, where 40% of the population still worked in agriculture, and the rural South remained in conditions closer to the 19th century than the 20th. This was not merely growth in the statistical sense. It was a transformation of daily life that millions of people could feel in their hands. Families who had grown up with nothing were bringing home their first televisions. Refrigerators appeared in apartments where food had previously been kept cool, however you could manage it. Young men who had grown up working their father's land in Calabria or Sicily were riding trains north and finding factory work that paid actual wages and writing money home to families who had never seen that kind of regularity. The Vespa, small, a little impractical, purely joyful, became something close to the national symbol of a country that had decided it was finally allowed to enjoy itself. Espresso bars multiplied on street corners. People had a little money and were not especially inclined toward caution. After what the country had lived through, who in the world could have blamed them? And Rome, sitting at the center of all of this new energy and new prosperity, was absorbing something beyond mere economic confidence. It was absorbing mythology. The world was paying attention, and Rome understood, the way Rome has always understood for 2,000 years, exactly how to perform for that attention. The Eternal City had had centuries of practice being looked at, and it was very, very good at it. But here is what Rome knew about itself, quietly, in the years when the cameras were all pointing the other direction. Beneath that performance, beneath the fur stoles and the flashbulbs, and the sense that life here had achieved something permanently enviable. There was a city of staggering and deliberate inequality. There was corruption so deeply embedded in the structure of Italian political life that it had effectively become the structure. There was a church that controlled more wealth than most economists could calculate and answered to no earthly authority about how any of it was spent or moved. There was a political class so insulated from accountability that it had not merely accepted its own untouchability, it had organized around it. And below all of this, invisible to the Via Veneto cafe tables, there were more than 1 million people living in Rome's peripheral housing estates in conditions that the miracle had bypassed entirely. The sweet life was very sweet if you were among the specific, carefully selected few who were actually living it. For the great majority of Romans, it was a story you watched from a distance, a film in which you were not cast. And the film, as we will discover together, was about to turn into something that no one on that set had been prepared to shoot. Let us begin at the place where the myth was most literally manufactured, a complex of studios on the southeastern edge of Rome that Benito Mussolini built in 1937 under the motto, "Cinema is the most powerful weapon." Cinecittà, Cinema City, the largest film studio in Europe. Mussolini had understood something that very few politicians of his generation could quite articulate: that the moving image was not entertainment in any frivolous sense. It was reality-making. It shaped what people believed about themselves and their world more powerfully than any speech or newspaper. He wanted Italian cinema to be a propaganda engine, a machine for producing the national mythology his regime required. What he got instead, after his overthrow and execution, was something rather more interesting. Cinecittà became Hollywood on the Tiber. Time magazine coined the phrase in June of 1950 during the early production of Quo Vadis, and it stuck immediately because it was simply accurate. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, a procession of American productions arrived at the studios outside Rome that would have seemed entirely fantastical a decade earlier. The commercial success of Quo Vadis in 1951, a massive biblical epic filmed partly at Cinecittà and partly on location around Rome, opened a door that the entire American film industry rushed through. Roman Holiday in 1953, which made Audrey Hepburn a star and gave the world an image of Rome, Hepburn on the back of a Vespa, hair short, face open, the Spanish Steps in the background, that has never quite left the cultural imagination. Helen of Troy, War and Peace, Ben-Hur in 1959, which won 11 Academy Awards and remained for decades the most honored film in Oscar history. And then, sitting at the very height of the Hollywood on the Tiber era, the production that became its own tabloid epic, and arguably marked the moment the era began to end, Cleopatra, 1963, 20th Century Fox, starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. The Cleopatra production is one of the great cautionary tales in the history of cinema. It ran disastrously over budget, beginning with the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars already spent in London, before the production relocated entirely to Rome in 1961. The film's costs ultimately reached what was, at the time, the largest production budget in Hollywood history. Fox nearly went bankrupt. The studio sold off significant portions of its assets to survive the production's financial demands. But the financial disaster, enormous as it was almost an afterthought beside the story that was generating actual headlines. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, both married to other people when filming began an affair during the production that became the most discussed celebrity scandal of the decade. The Italian press, which had been training for exactly this kind of story on Via Veneto's cafe circuit for years, covered it with an intensity that made the paparazzi on the street practically redundant. There was simply too much happening and too many reporters wanting to catch it. The paparazzi, that particular word. It is easy to forget that it did not exist before Federico Fellini gave it to the world. In La Dolce Vita, released in 1960, the year the era reached its cultural peak, Fellini named his tabloid photographer character Paparazzo, a man who understood that the private moment, captured without permission or dignity, was worth infinitely more than any posed image. The character was drawn from real men who had been working Via Veneto's nightly circuit for years, on Vespas and on foot, their flash guns ready, their moral calculations permanently skewed toward the shot. Anita Ekberg, the Swedish actress who starred in La Dolce Vita's most famous scene, stepping into the Trevi Fountain in a black dress in what became perhaps the most reproduced image in Italian cinema history, had a more complex relationship with the paparazzi in real life than the film's dreamy version suggested. On one documented occasion, after being followed from a night out all the way back to her home, she reappeared on her balcony, armed with a bow, and fired arrows at the photographers standing below. The paparazzi, who knew a better story than a mere photograph when they saw one, stayed and kept shooting. The paparazzi culture that Rome invented in those years was something entirely new to the world, and its invention says something worth pausing on about what Rome had become. Before Via Veneto, celebrity culture had operated on a relatively genteel arrangement. The star consented to be photographed under agreeable circumstances, the photographer received access in exchange for cooperation, and the image that emerged was controlled by publicists and studios, and the star's own management of their public face. What the men working Via Veneto's nightly circuit understood, and what Fellini immortalized in the paparazzo character, was that the unguarded moment, the stumble, the quarrel, the face without its professional mask, was worth 10 times the posed shot. They were not documenting celebrity, they were ambushing it, and in doing so, they were, without quite intending to, documenting the gap between what public life claimed to be and what it actually was. The Via Veneto scene had a rhythm to it that was almost theatrical in its predictability, which is perhaps why Fellini could reconstruct it so precisely on a Cinecittà soundstage. By day, the boulevard moved at the pace of a city that considered itself too sophisticated for urgency. Tables filled in the late morning, cleared for lunch, refilled through the long Roman afternoon. Journalists filed their columns from cafe tables. Small-time promoters circulated among the permanent fixtures, hoping to attach themselves to anything with commercial value. The glamour of the evening was already visible, in outline, in the mid-afternoon light. The luxury hotels with their uniformed doormen, the awnings over the sidewalk cafes with their little brass plaques, the slow parade of convertibles along the curved stretch of road that contained everything Rome wanted to project about itself. Then the sun went down, and something shifted in the quality of attention on the street. The people who arrived after 8 o'clock were operating in a more charged atmosphere, one where everyone present was at least partly performing for everyone else, and where the photographers who materialized from the shadows represented not merely an annoyance, but a kind of validation. If the flashbulbs went off when you arrived, you had achieved something. If they didn't, you hadn't. The celebrity circus of Rome in those years was intoxicating, genuinely extraordinary, and built on a foundation that most of the people enjoying it preferred not to examine. The cafes and the convertibles and the fur stoles and the flashbulbs existed in a Rome where the majority of the city's residents lived in conditions of fundamental material precarity. The two Romes, as Pier Paolo Pasolini had begun to understand almost the moment he arrived in the city, were not metaphors. They were postal addresses. Via Veneto was, at its most famous, a barely 200-yard curved boulevard lined with luxury hotels and famous cafes that attracted the rich, the louche, and the beautiful of the international jet set. The Hotel Excelsior and its sidewalk café, Doni, was essentially the stage on which the nightly performance of La Dolce Vita was mounted. The Café de Paris, Harry's Bar, the cocktail hour, which in Via Veneto terms could begin in the late afternoon and had no particular obligation to end before dawn. International financiers sat next to actors. Minor nobility, whose titles were, in many cases, considerably more recent than the elaborate palazzo addresses suggested, shared tables with American directors and with the particular category of women that Roman gossip columnists described as existing somewhere between aspiring actress and high-end escort, a distinction that in practice was often ornamental. It looked, to the world that was watching, like one long, magnificent party to which only the gilded and glittering had been invited. And in that specific sense it was. What it looked like from a few kilometers to the east or the west, from the window of an apartment in the neighborhoods that Rome's poor actually lived in, that was a rather different story. The borgate were not a secret. They simply existed in a category that Rome's mythology system had never learned to process. Built initially under Mussolini in the 1930s and 1940s, when the fascist government cleared Rome's historic centre of its poorer residents and literally moved them to the city's edges to make room for grand fascist architecture and the imperial aesthetic Mussolini was pursuing. The borgate were Rome's institutional answer to the question of where you put the people you cannot incorporate into your mythology. After the war, as the economic miracle began drawing workers from all over the rural south, from Calabria, from Sicily, from the poor agricultural regions of Campania and Basilicata, into the city, the borgate expanded with a speed that the infrastructure was never designed to accommodate. More than 1 million people were living in them by the early 1960s. 1 million people within the administrative boundaries of the same city that was being photographed for the cover of every magazine in the Western world, living in housing that was frequently unfinished. Walls without final plaster, floors without heating, buildings that had been constructed in a hurry and then not quite completed, as if the people who authorized them had expected something to change before the final details were required. There were areas of the borgate where running water was communal, shared among families through a single courtyard tap, where public transportation was theoretically available but practically so irregular that holding down a job in the city centre, the jobs that paid actual wages, required a level of logistical effort that drained resources and energy before the workday had begun, where children went to schools that were overcrowded at the best of times and inadequate at the worst. The migrants who arrived in these neighbourhoods brought with them not only their labour but their entire regional cultures. Calabrian dialect and Sicilian cooking and the specific collective psychology of people who had survived generations of hardship and were under no illusions about the distance between the story being told about Italy's prosperity and the daily material reality of their lives. They built communities in the borgate with the tools they had, the social structures of the village, the extended family as the primary economic unit, the particular warmth and ferocity of people who understand that they are on their own. The migrants who arrived in these neighbourhoods brought with them not only their labour, but their entire regional cultures. Calabrian dialect and Sicilian cooking and the specific collective psychology of people who had survived generations of hardship and were under no illusions about the distance between the story being told about Italy's prosperity and the daily material reality of their lives. They built communities in the borgate with the tools they had, the social structures of the village, the extended family as the primary economic unit, the particular warmth and ferocity of people who understand that they are on their own. What daily life actually looked like in the borgate in those years is something that the history of Rome, as it tends to be written, passes over with considerable speed, and so it is worth slowing down here. A typical morning for a family in Tiburtino, 3 or Pietralata, or one of the other borgata housing complexes might begin in an apartment of 3 or 4 small rooms shared between parents, children, and quite possibly a grandparent or an aunt's family. The kitchen, if the apartment had one that could be called such rather than a corner of a room where a gas ring sat, was where the day began and ended. The smell of coffee, of bread that had been bought the night before and was already going stale, of the particular morning mustiness of too many people in too little space. Getting a child to school required navigating a city that had not been planned around the needs of its peripheral residents. Getting to work, for the fathers doing construction work in the expanding city, for the mothers who cleaned the apartments of the families who lived closer to the Centro Storico, required early rising and uncertain transport, and the constant calculation of how much any given delay would cost in terms of employment or income that could not be recovered. What these neighbourhoods were not, despite the material difficulty, was culturally empty. Pasolini understood this from the moment he arrived among them. that the borgate were communities in the real sense, places where people knew each other with the intimacy of people thrown together by circumstances they hadn't chosen, where the unofficial networks of mutual support that develop when official support is absent were sophisticated and functional. The local bar, the informal credit extended among neighbours, the women who watched each other's children, the young men who congregated in the open spaces between buildings on evenings when the weather was tolerable. But none of this softened the fundamental fact that Rome was running two parallel economies, two parallel societies, two parallel sets of possibilities, and that the distance between them was maintained not through negligence but through structure. Pier Paolo Pasolini had arrived in Rome in 1950 as a young Bolognese poet, politically radical, intellectually voracious, and profoundly uninterested in the Italy that the magazines were celebrating. He moved to the borgata of Ponte Mamolo on the banks of the Anni River and got a job teaching school. What he found in those neighborhoods became the material of his first novels, his first films, and the beginning of a philosophical project that would occupy him for the rest of his life, an effort to see and describe the people that the miracle left behind, and to understand what was being destroyed in them by a prosperity that touched them only as spectacle. His Roman novels, Ragazzi di Vita and Una Vita Violenta, written in Roman dialect and set entirely in the borgate, caused immediate scandal when they were published in the mid-1950s. They were prosecuted for obscenity, they were praised by the Italian literary establishment and attacked by the church. They described a Rome that had nothing whatsoever to do with Via Veneto, a Rome of young men surviving through petty crime and prostitution, of women doing whatever they could to keep their families in a room, of a sub-proletariat that the economic miracle did not lift, but in Pasolini's view actively consumed, taking from them the only thing they had owned before the miracle came, the particular culture of poverty, the communal dignity of people who had built a way of living out of almost nothing. And from the borgate, Pasolini looked toward Via Veneto, and what he saw was not glamour. It was a performance being maintained at a cost that the performers had carefully arranged for others to pay. It is this understanding that Rome's sweet life and Rome's poverty were not separate stories, but the same story told from different positions, that makes sense of what we need to examine next. Because the people at the top of Rome's glamour world in those years, the pseudo-aristocrats and the political families and the men with connections in every direction simultaneously, were not simply enjoying their good fortune. Some of them were actively working to make sure that the structures that maintained their position would never be seriously threatened. And that project required things, financial arrangements, political protections, the management of inconvenient truths that would come to define Rome's real history far more completely than any photograph of a fur stole and a cocktail glass ever could, which is why we need to talk about a 21-year-old woman named Wilma Montesi, a beach 40 kilometers from Rome, and the can of worms that her death pried open with a force that took years to fully feel. On April 9th, 1953, Wilma Montesi did not return home from an afternoon errand. She was from a working-class Roman family in the Prati neighborhood. Her father, a carpenter. Her life entirely ordinary by every available account. There was nothing about her that should have threatened anyone. She was simply young, and she was simply gone. 36 hours after she was reported missing, her body was found washed onto a deserted stretch of beach at Tor Vaianica on the coast south of Rome. The investigation moved with a swiftness that, in retrospect, had more to do with the desired conclusion than with thoroughness. The official verdict came quickly and was announced as a settled matter. She had gone to the beach to soak her feet, a common practice at the time for minor ailments, and had accidentally drowned. Case closed. But Rome, in the early 1950s, had already developed a press that was less deferential to official conclusions than the Italian establishment had perhaps anticipated. A journalist named Silvano Muto began publishing pieces that challenged the accident theory. He had a source who was willing to talk. Her name was Maria Kallio, and her testimony, when it eventually reached a courtroom, was the most significant public exposure of a hidden Rome since the war. Caglio had been the companion of a man named Ugo Montagna, and Montagna was at the center of the story that the official investigation had been so careful not to tell. Montagna was one of the more instructive figures Rome produced in that era. He had no genuine aristocratic lineage. He was a property speculator and entrepreneur who had constructed a social identity of sufficient polish that Via Veneto accepted him without much examination. He was described variously as silver-tongued, charming, physically imposing, and very well connected. The connections running from the café society of the boulevard in multiple directions simultaneously, including, it was alleged, into the structures of the Italian government, the mafia, and the Rome police. He rented a private villa called Capocotta on the coast south of Rome, very close, as it happened, to the beach where Wilma Montesi's body was found. The villa was known in certain circles for private gatherings that brought together powerful men, political figures, and available young women in circumstances that required discretion to be maintained absolutely. It was not the kind of place that appeared in newspapers, which was precisely the point. Montagna's close acquaintance included Piero Piccioni, a jazz musician, a playboy, and the son of Attilio Piccioni, then Italy's foreign minister. Caglio's account placed Piccioni at Capocotta on the night relevant to Wilma Montesi's death, and she alleged that Montagna's network had been instrumental in ensuring that the official investigation arrived at its conclusion by the most expedient route possible. What Caglio described when she finally testified, in a trial that attracted paparazzi, daily front pages, and a level of public attention that Rome had not focused on a single court case since the war, was not simply a cover-up of one death, terrible as that was. She described a world of private parties at secluded villas where political immunity functioned as a practical guarantee against consequence, where young women from ordinary backgrounds were drawn into circles of power with very little understanding of how entirely disposable they were within those circles, where drugs were present, where the rules that governed ordinary Italian life simply did not apply, and where the networks that maintained this arrangement extended from the men at the party tables straight into the offices of the people who would theoretically investigate any complaint. Rome's communist newspapers ran this as evidence of an aristocracy of corruption that had never been held to account. Rome's right-wing papers ran it as evidence of moral degeneracy. Both were, in their different ways, correct. The trial became a proxy war between Italy's political factions, each using the details of Wilma Montesi's death and the world her death had illuminated to prosecute their opponents. Piccioni was ultimately acquitted. Montagna emerged with his social reputation damaged, but his legal position intact. The question of what happened to Wilma Montesi on that beach was never satisfactorily resolved, but the Montesi affair had done something that no verdict could take back. It had drawn a line between the official story of Rome and the real one, in ink visible to anyone who cared to look. It had shown, without room for comfortable denial, that certain people in Rome operated under a fundamentally different set of rules, that the aristocracy of the cocktail circuit was in many cases a performance rather than an inheritance, that the distance between Via Veneto and the borgate was legal as well as geographic, was protected, not merely incidental. Fellini, who was absorbing everything Rome offered him with the attentiveness of a man who understood that the city was giving him his life's work, drew directly from the moral atmosphere of the Montesi affair when constructing La Dolce Vita. The scene of the aristocratic party outside Rome, where the guests drift through ancient ruins in a state of dissolute boredom, where the relationships between the characters reveal a world of privilege that has consumed all its own meaning, that was not invented, it was observed. Fellini, who was absorbing everything Rome offered him with the attentiveness of a man who understood that the city was giving him his life's work, drew directly from the moral atmosphere of the Montesi affair when constructing La Dolce Vita. The scene of the aristocratic party outside Rome, where the guests drift through ancient ruins in a state of dissolute boredom, where the relationships between the characters reveal a world of privilege that has consumed all its own meaning, that was not invented. It was observed. La Dolce Vita was released in February of 1960 and caused a scandal that was itself instructive. Church groups and Roman nobility demanded it be banned. Right-wing politicians who had rallied to earlier Fellini films found this one intolerable. Liberals rushed to its defense, citing it as an accurate portrait of the corruption of Italy's upper class. What was interesting about this argument, in retrospect, is how both sides essentially agreed on the facts. The church and the aristocracy objected not because they disputed the accuracy of the portrait, but because they disputed the right of the portrait to be made. The liberal defenders confirmed the accuracy of the critique as their central argument. Nobody, essentially, was claiming that the world the film depicted did not exist. The argument was about whether it should be shown. The film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1960. The word paparazzi entered multiple languages within a year of its release. The Trevi Fountain scene became one of the most reproduced images in cinema history. Rome had never been so internationally famous, and the city knew at some level that what Fellini had made was not quite a love letter. It was a diagnosis, an extremely beautiful, extremely stylish, formally perfect diagnosis, but a diagnosis nonetheless. And if the Montesi affair showed the corruption of Rome's secular ruling class with painful clarity, the story that was quietly assembling itself in the years that followed would reveal something even more unsettling: that the rot had extended its reach all the way to the institution whose dome presided over the entire Roman skyline, the Vatican Bank. Its formal name, the Institute for the Works of Religion, the IOR in Italian, describes its stated purpose with a precision that is almost quaint in retrospect. Founded in 1942 by Pope Pius XII to manage funds belonging to the clergy and to Catholic charitable organizations worldwide, it was, on paper, a financial support mechanism for an institution dedicated to religious and humanitarian work. It had two characteristics that set it apart from every other bank operating in Rome in the post-war years, and these characteristics would prove to be either its most useful features or its most catastrophic vulnerabilities, depending entirely on whose perspective you were considering. First, the Vatican Bank was not subject to Italian financial law. The Vatican is a sovereign state. Its borders run through the centre of Rome, and when money crossed those borders, it ceased to be subject to the oversight of the Italian government, the Bank of Italy, or any Italian regulatory body whatsoever. Second, the bank published no balance sheets. Its accounts were entirely private, its transactions were entirely internal, and its one shareholder, the Pope, was not in the habit of answering questions about the institution's financial affairs. For much of the 1940s and 1950s, these features were simply the unremarkable administrative reality of a small sovereign entity. But by the early 1960s, someone had begun to understand that these features were not administrative technicalities. They were an architecture of opportunity. Michele Sindona was born in Sicily in 1920 and had become, by the early 1960s, one of the most influential financiers in Italy, a man whose charm and apparent sophistication made powerful people feel that being associated with him was itself a form of success. His personal friendship with Giovanni Battista Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, opened doors that no ordinary financial advisor could have reached. When the Vatican decided in the 1960s that its considerable investment portfolio should be managed with greater sophistication, Sindona was the man they turned to. What the Vatican was not fully aware of, or chose not to be fully aware of, which is not quite the same thing, was the full scope of Sindona's other professional relationships. These included the Gambino crime family in New York, the American and Sicilian mafias, and a subversive Masonic lodge called Propaganda Due, known as P2, whose membership list and activities would not be fully exposed until 1981, but whose reach was already extraordinary. One of Sindona's primary services to his criminal clients was money movement, taking funds generated through illegal activities, narcotics trafficking above all, but also other organized crime revenue, and finding them clean passage through the financial system. The Vatican Bank was, for this purpose, almost perfectly suited. Dirty Liar entered Italy in cash. They crossed the border into Vatican City. They left as clean deposits in Swiss accounts that bore no particular record of their origin. The transition, in each case, was a few hundred meters of Roman geography. The scale of what Sindona was doing through Vatican-linked channels in the 1960s and early 1970s was enormous. When his American company, Franklin National Bank, collapsed in 1974 in what was at that moment one of the largest bank failures in American financial history, the Vatican found itself with an estimated $30 million in losses. Sindona was eventually convicted of fraud in both the United States and Italy, and was extradited back to Italy in 1984. In March of 1986, while serving a 25-year sentence at a prison in Voghera, he drank a cup of coffee laced with cyanide. He died 2 days later. Whether the poison was self-administered or supplied by someone who preferred that he remain permanently unavailable for further testimony has never been established. But before Sindona fell, he had introduced the Vatican to his financial protégé, a man who would take the operation that Sindona had built to a scale and a complexity that made Sindona's activities look almost modest by comparison. Roberto Calvi was born in Milan in 1920 and had spent his entire professional life in the patient ascent toward the center of Italian financial power. He joined Banco Ambrosiano after the Second World War, moved steadily through its ranks, and became its chairman in 1975. Banco Ambrosiano was not just any bank. It was Italy's second largest private bank, with a history that stretched back to 1896 and a reputation built on Catholic respectability, conservative management, and the kind of institutional solidity that Italian depositors trusted absolutely. Its very name, Ambrosiano, honoring St. Ambrose, the 4th century bishop of Milan, signaled a connection to Catholic tradition that was, at every level, fraudulent. Calvi was, by the time he reached the chairmanship, a member of Propaganda Due. He was also building a financial network of extraordinary complexity, a web of offshore subsidiaries in the Bahamas, Luxembourg, and multiple South American countries, designed to move money through channels that the Italian central bank could not easily follow. The Vatican Bank, whose president was a man named Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, was not just adjacent to this network, it was central to it. Marcinkus was a large, direct man from Cicero, Illinois, who had come to Rome through the Vatican's diplomatic service and found himself, in the early 1970s, appointed to run an institution whose finances he was in no technical sense qualified to manage. He had been sent on a 6-week crash course at Harvard before being handed oversight of what was, by this point, a portfolio valued in the billions. He and Calvi were not merely professional associates. They were friends, fellow P2 members, and the relationship between their two institutions, between Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank, was the axis around which the entire structure turned. What Calvi was moving through these channels was staggering in its scope. Funds for the mafia, specifically the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, were laundered through Ambrosiano's offshore subsidiaries, with Vatican accounts providing the institutional guarantee that kept regulators at a distance. Money for P2's political operations flowed through the same channels. Funds were directed to South American regimes. One of P2's projects, gaining control over Rizzoli Publishing, and through it the Corriere della Sera, Italy's most prestigious newspaper, was financed through Ambrosiano, with Vatican connections providing the cover. The Italian central bank began pulling at the threads of what Calvi was doing in the late 1970s. In 1978, they produced a report that described billions of lire in illegal transactions and predicted catastrophic future consequences. The magistrate who had been assigned to oversee the investigation into those findings was subsequently shot and killed by a left-wing terrorist group. The central bank inspector, who had supervised the original examination, was imprisoned on fraud charges that were later entirely dismissed. The investigation stalled repeatedly. Each time it approached something significant, something happened to redirect it. In June of 1982, what the Italian central bank had predicted finally arrived. Banco Ambrosiano collapsed with debts that investigators placed somewhere between $700 million and $1.5 billion. The gap between those two figures itself indicating the complexity of the structure and the difficulty of accurately accounting for the missing money. Calvi's personal secretary, Graziella Corroche, left a note on her desk denouncing him and leapt from the window of her office. Calvi himself left Rome on a false passport, travelling under the name Gian Roberto Calvini, moving through Venice and onward to London by private plane. On the morning of June 18, 1982, a postal worker crossing London's Blackfriars Bridge in the early hours noticed something unusual beneath the bridge's scaffolding. The dead man had bricks stuffed into his pockets. He had thousands of pounds in cash on his person. He was suspended from the scaffolding of a bridge whose location, Blackfriars, may or may not have carried Masonic significance, depending on how much weight you give to what his killers may have intended by the choice. His name was Roberto Calvi, and he had been known in the Italian financial press as God's banker for his connections to the Holy See. 2 coroner's inquests and a subsequent independent investigation all reached the same conclusion. Roberto Calvi had been murdered. 5 suspects, including senior mafia figures and P2 associates, were brought to trial in Rome in 2007. All 5 were acquitted. No one has ever been convicted of killing Roberto Calvi. His briefcase, which he had been carrying when he fled Rome, and which was known to contain documents whose contents could have been catastrophic for multiple parties simultaneously, was never found. In 1984, the Vatican Bank agreed to pay $224 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors as a formal recognition of moral involvement in the bank's collapse, while simultaneously and specifically denying any legal liability. Archbishop Marcinkus remained president of the Vatican Bank until 1989, protected throughout by Vatican sovereign immunity from the Italian arrest warrants issued for his questioning. He died in 2006 in Sun City, Arizona, having never answered formally for anything. To live in Rome through those years, knowing any portion of this story, was to exist in a city where the most recognizable institution on the skyline was conducting financial operations that would have imprisoned ordinary citizens, and where the sovereign immunity of a 444-acre state inside your city made consequence structurally impossible to reach. But the Vatican's financial world was not operating in isolation. It was connected through Sindona and Calvi, and through the institution they all shared, to a shadow organization that was woven into the fabric of Italian public life, in a way that makes the word conspiracy feel somehow inadequate to describe it. Propaganda Jew. P2. A Masonic lodge that had existed in legitimate form in the 19th century and had been transformed under the grand mastership of Lizio Gelli into something that had no real precedent in Italian life. A structured network for the placement of trusted members throughout every institution in Italy that controlled information, investigation, or political power. When Italian police raided Gelli's villa at Arezzo in 1981 and found his membership list, the document was not simply explosive. It was architecturally terrifying in what it revealed about how comprehensively Italian institutions had been infiltrated. Nearly 1,000 names, military generals at the highest ranks, judges whose decisions in P2-connected cases suddenly appeared in a different light, newspaper editors, the heads of Italian intelligence services, television executives, cabinet ministers, current and former, senior figures in the police and the Carabinieri. The list was a shadow government, a parallel architecture of power that had been quietly assembled over decades and that existed specifically to protect itself from the official structures that were supposed to provide oversight of exactly these kinds of arrangements. P2 members were positioned to stall investigations, to redirect prosecutorial attention, to ensure that certain cases never came to trial, that certain documents were never formally examined, that certain witnesses remained permanently unavailable. The effectiveness of this positioning was visible in the way that investigation after investigation into P2-connected activities came to nothing. The magistrate assassinated, the inspector imprisoned, the witnesses disappeared or recanting, the evidence mishandled. The lodge's suspected involvement extended to the most violent episodes of the period Italy calls the anni di piombo, the years of lead. On December 12, 1969, a bomb exploded inside the Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura in Piazza Fontana in Milan, killing 17 people and wounding 88 others. It was the opening shot of what would become a decade of sustained political violence, and the investigation into who planted the bomb ran for decades, ultimately connecting through long chains of association to neo-fascist networks that overlapped with Italian intelligence services, and, investigators alleged, with structures of the state that were using violence to prevent a leftward shift in Italian politics. The strategy of tension, it came to be called, the deliberate promotion of instability and fear in order to keep the Italian electorate in a state of anxious conservatism. This was not, it bears emphasizing, a theory spun in the dark. Parliamentary investigations confirmed key elements of it. NATO's Operation Gladio, a Cold War-era network of secret stay-behind operatives, arms caches, and trained personnel positioned across Western Europe to resist potential Soviet occupation, had left behind infrastructure that, in Italy's case, some investigators found overlapping with the most violent attacks of the era. The Italicus train bombing in 1974, the Bologna train station massacre in August 1980, which killed 85 people and wounded more than 200, the single deadliest terrorist attack in Italian post-war history. These were attributed to right-wing extremists. The investigations led to P2. The investigations stalled. And while all of this was happening at the level of covert institutional power, ordinary Romans were living through it in the granular, daily, exhausting texture of a city that felt dangerous in ways that could not be predicted or mapped. Professors who taught political theory at Roman universities learned to check under their cars before driving to work, not as melodrama, as a practical precaution. Judges who presided over cases involving political violence, cases that were being interfered with before they reached verdict, received police escorts and lived with the knowledge that the escort was both a protection and an announcement. You are a target. Politicians of sufficient prominence travelled in armoured vehicles through streets that had been beautiful and open just a decade before. This brings us to the period that closed La Dolce Vita's era and opened something that Rome had no experience navigating, the years when the city stopped being a set and started being a battleground. By the mid-1960s, Rome's extraordinary decade of international glamour was already quietly ending. London had seized the cultural momentum, the Beatles, swinging London, a new energy aimed at youth rather than aristocracy. The great Hollywood epics at Cinecittà were becoming commercially unsustainable. The Cleopatra disaster in 1963 had marked the high watermark and the beginning of the retreat. The paparazzi were still working Via Veneto, but the quality of what they were finding had changed. The stars who had made the street famous were moving on. The hotels remained, the cafes remained, the mythology remained. But the living spectacle that had justified the mythology was losing its voltage. What came to take its place was something that Via Veneto had never been built to accommodate: politics. The student movements of 1968 arrived in Rome as they arrived in Paris and Berlin and Tokyo. Young people, educated in the prosperity of the economic miracle and deeply skeptical of the institutions that miracle had produced, occupying universities and staging confrontations with a system they found fundamentally dishonest. In Rome, the confrontations at La Sapienza University were among the most intense in Europe. Police and students fought in streets that a few years earlier had been full of nothing more dangerous than paparazzi and Vespas. Then the hot autumn of 1969, a wave of factory strikes and occupations that spread through Italy's industrial north and sent political shockwaves south to Rome. Workers who had fueled the miracle without sharing its rewards, demanding a different arrangement. Unions growing in power and militancy. A Christian Democrat government that had been managing Italy's politics as a near-permanent arrangement since the war, suddenly facing challenges it had no existing framework to contain. In Rome's universities, a generation of young people who had grown up knowing no Italy except the prosperous, internationally celebrated one were confronting, for what felt like the first time, what that prosperity had actually required and what it had actually produced. The inequality was not invisible to them. Pasolini's work had made it impossible to claim ignorance, if you were paying attention. The permanent dominance of a single party in a system theoretically organized around democratic competition was not invisible either. The aristocracy of the Montesi affair, the Vatican Bank connections, the P2 networks that would eventually surface, these were not yet public in any systematic way, but their effects were felt in the way that power persistently insulated itself from accountability. Italy changed governments more than 50 times between 1946 and the early 1990s, 50 times. The appearance of democratic dynamism concealed beneath it a permanent ruling class that simply rotated positions and titles while maintaining the same essential structure. The country looked, from outside, like a vibrant parliamentary democracy. From inside, particularly to young people who had studied how democracy was supposed to function and were comparing it against what they could see around them, it looked like something else. And from that specific disillusionment, educated, bitter, genuinely aggrieved, and very poorly served by the institutions that should have channeled it toward constructive ends, something was beginning to form that would make the paparazzi on Via Veneto seem like noise from another century. The Red Brigades, the Brigate Rossa, were the face of this terror that most Italians recognized most clearly. Founded in 1970 by activists radicalized through the factory occupations and university movements of the late 1960s, explicitly Marxist-Leninist in their ideology, drawing on revolutionary theory from Cuba and Latin America, they had spent the early years of the decade building towards something. Their early operations were targeted and symbolic, kidnapping industrialists for a few hours, then releasing them, shooting targets in the legs in a practice they called kneecapping, bank robberies to fund operations, bombings at the margins. By the mid-1970s, they had carried out 8 symbolic kidnappings, all ending in the victim's release. They described these as stages in an escalating confrontation with the Italian state. The 9th kidnapping was different. In 1979 alone, Italian authorities recorded 2,514 acts of terrorism, more than 6 per day. The number requires sitting with for a moment. In 1979, in a country that the world associated with beauty and food and history and cinema, there were 6 or more acts of terrorism every single day. Rome absorbed this as a city that had already been absorbing it for years, absorbs what has become, if not acceptable, at least routine. The particular numbness of a population that has had no choice but to practice living alongside an undifferentiated threat. The morning of March 16th, 1978 began as any Tuesday morning in Rome began. Spring was coming on, the light was changing, the city was in motion. Aldo Moro was travelling to the Italian Parliament for a confidence vote on a new government led by former Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti. Moro was not merely a politician. He was, in the assessment of most people who studied Italian politics, the most skilled practitioner of the art of the possible that the Christian Democrat Party had ever produced. He had been Prime Minister 5 times. He was, at the moment of his abduction, the president of his party and the architect of an effort that had consumed years of careful political work. A historic compromise that would bring the Italian Communist Party, for the first time, into formal support of the government coalition. This was, in Moro's view, the necessary next step for Italian democracy. For certain other interests, foreign and domestic, it was a step that could not be permitted to occur. Moro's convoy moved through the streets of Rome with 5 bodyguards. In the narrow Via Fani, the Red Brigades were waiting. The operation they had prepared was executed with a precision that has genuinely never been satisfactorily explained. The ambush was so clean, so professionally coordinated, so completely without the operational imprecision you would expect from a group of young urban guerrillas, that the gap between the Red Brigade's known capabilities and what actually happened in Via Fani has been a subject of serious investigation an unresolved debate ever since. All 5 of Moro's bodyguards were killed in the initial exchange of fire. Moro himself was pulled from the car, placed in a waiting vehicle, and driven somewhere into Rome. For 55 days, Italy held its breath. The Red Brigades sent communiques to the press, numbered statements from what they called the People's Prison, demanding the release of imprisoned comrades in exchange for Moro's life, and subjecting him, in text, to the theatrical procedure of a people's court. They released photographs of Moro. The images showed a man who had visibly aged, dressed in the same suit he had been wearing on the day of his abduction, positioned against a backdrop bearing the Red Brigade's 5-pointed star. In a series of letters released through the Red Brigade's channels, Moro wrote to his colleagues, to the Pope, to his wife. He argued for negotiation. He pleaded, in terms that became increasingly personal and desperate, for the government to find a way to bring him home. The Italian government, under firm guidance from NATO allies and from an American administration that had watched Moro's Communist Party coalition project with deep alarm, refused to negotiate under any circumstances. The state, the position held, could not yield to terrorist pressure. To do so would be to legitimize the Red Brigades and invite further operations. The line was absolute. The line held. Pope Paul VI made a public appeal for Moro's release, addressing himself directly to the Red Brigades in terms of personal mercy and Christian principle. Reports have emerged since, from participants in the Vatican discussions of those days, that the Pope had wanted his public statement to leave a door open, that the phrase, "without conditions," which appeared in the final published text and which effectively foreclosed any negotiation, was inserted into the statement against his wishes. Whether this is accurate has never been definitively confirmed. What Moro's subsequent letter to the Pope suggested, in its tone, was that the imprisoned man felt abandoned by the Church in a way he had not expected. On the morning of May 9, 1978, Aldo Moro's body was discovered in the trunk of a red Renault 4 in Via Veneto, in the historic centre of Rome. He had been shot multiple times. The car had been parked at a location that was precisely, almost geometrically, equidistant between the national headquarters of the Christian Democrat Party and the national headquarters of the Italian Communist Party. The Red Brigades had chosen the location with care. The message was intentional and entirely legible. This was not random. This was a statement. It was Italy's 11th of September, wrote Ezio Mauro, the editor of La Repubblica, years later. The comparison is not hyperbole. The event produced, in Rome and across Italy, a grief and a rage and a specific quality of shock that a country experiences when something has happened that it cannot place within the categories it previously used to understand itself. Moro's wife Eleonora, in the terrible days that followed, said something that Rome did not forget. She said, "My blood will fall on them." Her use of her husband's words in that context, not a curse exactly, not a promise, but a reckoning, captured something about how the city received the murder that no official statement could. The Red Brigades had miscalculated in one crucial respect. They had believed that the murder of Aldo Moro would radicalize Italian public opinion and accelerate their revolutionary project. What it did instead was crystallize, in the Italian population, a rejection of political violence so comprehensive that the brigades lost the minimal popular sympathy they had maintained through their earlier operations. The Italian state, its will hardened by the crisis and its methods sharpened by necessity, began systematically dismantling the organization in the early 1980s, through intelligence work, through mass prosecution, and through a policy of offering significantly reduced sentences to imprisoned members who cooperated. By the mid-1980s, the Brigate Ross had ceased to function as an operational organization. By the end of the decade, they had formally dissolved. But the questions they had surfaced, about who in Rome's shadow structures had interests aligned with certain outcomes of the years of lead, about what had and had not been done to find Aldo Moro in 55 days when the Italian state possessed extensive security resources, about whose interests were served by his death. those questions did not dissolve with the organization. They remain, in Italian public discourse, genuinely and specifically unresolved. 3 years before Moro's body was found in that car, Rome had experienced a death that certain people felt, in the months after it happened, had been not merely a crime, but a warning, a signal sent to the city's most honest observer about what happened to people who persisted in seeing what the comfortable preferred not to. On the night of November 1st, 1975, Pier Paolo Pasolini drove from his home in Rome toward Ostia, toward the flat wasteland at the city's coastal edge, where the urban periphery runs out of road and runs into the sea. He was 53 years old. He had spent 25 years in Rome as arguably its most uncomfortable intellectual, a man whose communism, Catholicism, and homosexuality, braided together in ways that made every political faction simultaneously claim and reject him, had produced a body of work that cut through the mythology of Italian life with a precision that was, depending on your perspective, either prophetic or intolerable. His films had ranged from the delicate neorealism of Accattone, his debut in 1961, set entirely in Rome's borgate among the very people he had lived alongside since arriving in the city, to the radical provocation of Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, his final film, completed just before his death. Salo used the Marquis de Sade's structure to restage the violence of Italian fascism, turning it into something so formally brutal that its political intention was almost overwhelmed by the visceral response it produced. It was released posthumously. Pasolini knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that what he was doing had enemies. On the morning of November 2nd, a woman living near Ostia noticed a shape in the waste ground in front of her house that she initially took for dumped garbage. It was not garbage, it was Pier Paolo Pasolini, beaten so severely that his own acquaintances could not at first identify him, and run over by his own Alfa Romeo. He had been killed at the edge of the city he had spent his adult life writing about, in the specific kind of nowhere that he had described in his earliest Roman work, as the place where the city's expelled and overlooked people were quietly deposited to survive as best they could. A 17-year-old Roman named Giuseppe Pelosi was arrested within hours and confessed to the killing. He was convicted. In 2005, Pelosi recanted his confession entirely, stating that he had not acted alone and had been threatened into his original account. His conviction was subsequently overturned. Investigators reopened the case and explored connections between Pelosi and networks in Rome's neo-fascist underground. No further charges were filed. The case remains, technically and practically, unsolved. In the months and years after his death, Italian intellectuals and ordinary readers processed Pasolini's murder with a grief that could not entirely separate itself from the sense that it had been inevitable. That a man who had spent his career pointing at exactly the things that the powerful in Rome had built their power on the concealment of, could not have expected indefinite protection from those things. His last published newspaper essay, written in the hours before he was killed, accused members of Italy's political and business establishment of crimes that he stated he could document and prove. He did not name names in that final piece. He had named names in others, many times, over many years. Whether Pasolini was killed in a random encounter that turned violent, in a planned political assassination, or in something between those categories that Italy's systems of protection and omerta have never allowed to be fully examined, remains genuinely open. What is not open is what his death represented to Rome and to the people who had read him. The city had lost the person most committed to refusing its comfortable mythologies. And it had lost him in exactly the place, the dark periphery, the wasteland at the city's edge, the nowhere between the beautiful story and the material reality that he had spent his career trying to make visible. There is a way of understanding what Rome was, across those 2 decades from the early 1960s to the late 1970s, that requires holding 2 images in mind simultaneously without letting either one cancel the other out. The first image, Via Veneto, in 1960. The night is warm. The flashbulbs are going. Anita Ekberg is walking to her car in that black dress. The paparazzi are circling. Somebody's cocktail glass catches the light just perfectly. The entire street smells of expensive perfume and cigarette smoke, and the particular kind of ambition that only flourishes in cities that make ambition look beautiful. The image is extraordinary. It is not false. People really did live like that on that street, in those years, in that city. The pleasure was real. The clothes were real. The glamour, in the specific technical sense of a spell cast over the observer, was real. The second image, Via Caetani, May 9th, 1978. A red Renault 4. A trunk. The city quiet for a moment in a way that cities that have just had something catastrophic revealed to them are sometimes briefly quiet before the noise returns. Both of those images are Rome. Both of those moments belong to the same city, the same era, the same story. The Trevi Fountain and the body in the trunk, Cinecittà's dream factory and the borgate that housed 1 million invisible people, the Vatican dome catching the sunset, and the billions flowing beneath it in directions that bore no relation to any religious principle anyone had ever articulated. Wilma Montesi on the beach and the party at Capocotta 2 kilometers away. Roberto Calvi hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge with bricks in his pockets. Pasolini in the wasteland. Rome was never a city that could be contained in one story. It is the city that invented the idea of being eternal, which means it has had 2,000 years of practice maintaining multiple contradictory versions of itself simultaneously. What the 1960s and 1970s revealed, in slow and then increasingly rapid accumulation, was the cost of that particular talent, the cost that was paid not by the people on Via Veneto, but by the 1 million people in the borgate, by the judges who checked under their cars, by the families of the bodyguards killed in Via Fani, by a working-class woman named Wilma Montesi, whose death touched something that no one with power in Rome had any interest in honestly examining. The sweet life required a vast infrastructure of silence to maintain itself. When the silence broke, and it broke not all at once but in fragments, across years, through trials and murders and collapses and communiques, and a poet beaten beyond recognition in the dark, what was revealed was a city of extraordinary human beauty and extraordinary human failure, running in parallel, the one sustaining the other, in ways that the mythology had always worked very hard to prevent anyone from noticing. And perhaps that is the most deeply Roman thing of all. Not the beauty and not the darkness, but the practiced, ancient, almost architectural skill with which the one was used to make the other impossible to look at directly. Thank you so much for spending this time with us tonight, dear friends. If this journey through Rome's hidden history moved you, surprised you, or left you sitting with something you hadn't considered before, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Every like, every subscription, every comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. These are what allow this channel to keep existing and to keep telling the stories that deserve to be told. Stay curious, stay close, and wherever you are tonight, rest well.